Hello, and welcome to another engaging episode of Stan the History Man. And I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. Now, today I'd like to talk about the Great Depression. The Great Depression, of course, 1930, let's say, through to 1939. It's supposedly, well, it begins with the stock market crash of 1929 and then goes on until about 1939 when war orders from the European War start to pour into American factories and putting people to work. Well, one of the first things I want to mention about this is something that is of strong misapprehension about the Great Depression, and that is that President Roosevelt, ended it. Well, that's not true. It's a widespread misapprehension, though. Twice on um, public broadcasts on TV, I've heard that he lifted us from the Depression. He did not. In 1939, which you could call the end of the Depression, unemployment was about 14%. Now, that's pretty high after 7 or 8 years of trying to get things out of the Depression. Now, to be fair, Roosevelt unemployment did go down from about 1/3 in 1932 to about, let's say, 14% in 1939, but still, that's not ending the Depression. I sometimes used to tell my students he may not have ended the Depression, he made us feel good about it. And that's true. Roosevelt was a very engaging, popular, personable person. Although he himself personally was very hard to find out what he really was all about. He usually agreed with the last person that was in the room with him. But Orson Welles, a great actor himself, said to Roosevelt, uh, we two are the two most accomplished actors in the United States. The Depression was the thing that it's the best historians would credit it for better or for worse, is for the federal government to become involved with individual Americans. Now, before this time, there were uh, uh, government programs and so on to help businesses. For example, the railroads were subsidized by the government. At least the government gave them government land, for the railroads to build on, and the land would be developed, and the railroads could take advantage of that. In fact, to show the opposition to personal aid from the government in the 1880s, there's a terrible drought in Texas, not unusual that I know, and ranchers were begging the Democrat government under the Democratic president uh, Ben Cleveland, Grover Cleveland. I don't know why I couldn't think of his name. And the only president, by the way, to have a gap in his he had 2 terms, but there was a gap, a Republican gap in between. At any rate, they petitioned him to get an executive order to release government stocks of seed corn to or seed feed to them, and he said, "No, I'm not going to do it because the government aid helps the country as a whole, but not individuals." And that pretty well held out right through until the 1930s. A good example would be the policies of Herbert Hoover. They said he didn't do anything for the Depression. Well, he did a lot, but not for individuals. One of the uh, most noteworthy to me as a rail fan was they under Hoover's executive orders. They electrified the railroad line from Washington to New York City. And some of you may well have traveled on that line. It's all electrified. It's smooth, clean, and everything. But then went to the Pennsylvania Railroad and said, well, that's going to put a lot of electricians to work, and so on. The problem was they say during that the bottom of the Depression, those new electric trains were going between fast and smooth between the two cities, but the porters on the trains were just playing cards because there's nobody there to serve. So a lot of Americans said, "Why are you helping big fat cat companies like Pennsylvania Railroad," which was, by the way, the biggest company in the United States at the time? Can you believe that? The Pennsylvania Railroad doesn't even exist anymore. But anyway, uh, So that really, with the election, presidential election, 1932, Hoover was clobbered, and the Democrats came in with Roosevelt and, of course, control of both houses. And that's where Roosevelt began his programs of helping individuals. One of the best things he did, by the way, was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. A lot of individual Americans had lost their savings because they kind of the idea that the banks back then thought, well, they just kind of put them in a vault somewhere. Well, no, they invest them, and if the investments go bad, then the bank goes bad too. So, at a relatively minor economic cost, the government sold insurance to the banks, and they would then be guaranteed. And so therefore, when you go to a bank, most banks, you'll see a member FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and anything up to, I think it's now $250,000, you're safe. The government will give the bank, pay the bank, and which has been paying premiums on the typical insurance policy, but it's for the banks and for which benefits the individual depositors. But it gets down into more directly individuals with all these programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which in those days cut down on the amount of food. Here Americans are going hungry, and the AAA and AAA cut down on it. They paid farmers not to grow. All right. This was not just an American thing, although it's big, but to a large extent it was American. Brazilians, though, were taking lots of coffee out into the ocean and dumping it. Well, that keeps the price of coffee up. Farmers out west were dumping milk, but the AAA tried to regularize these, pay farmers actually for not growing. So farmers, price of food will go up, and farmers will not lose their farms. Although, again, it sounds kind of paradoxical. People are hungry, so we cut down on the production of food. There's all kinds of things like that various government agencies to protect individual Americans. And one of the most direct and, in a way, kind of scary programs was the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. And this was a program to regulate prices, wages, working hours, everything by the central government. And you didn't have to join it, but it was open with a tremendous hoopla. There were parades down Broadway, down Pennsylvania Avenue, with all kinds of workers with support the NRA. We are the NRA people, and that they also had the manufacturers who joined the NRA had to recognize the workers' rights. And if people who joined, institutions that joined, would put up this like a blue eagle, and again, you didn't have to join, but if you didn't join, a lot of people said you don't care, and they wouldn't patronize that place. And it regulated everything. There were people who went to jail. I remember I read about a radio manufacturer went to jail because he was charging too little for his radios. Well, you got that wrong, right? No, too little. Want to keep the prices up. See, this was a period of depression, all right? So the value of money went up. And so if you had any money, you were doing fairly well. Anyway, like this guy was charging $3 for his radios, and the official price set by the government. All these experts said, now this is a fair price, $5, let's say. I'm just pulling his figures out of a hat, but I mean, but he went to jail briefly for that. There was a famous sick chicken case that went to the Supreme Court. Poultry, Yiddish poultry manufacturers were different ways of examining the chicken, and they didn't use the government way; they used the traditional way, and they didn't go to jail. They fought it right through to the Supreme Court, and the court said no, and they threw out the whole NRA program. Now, I would say that this is the closest America came to fascism, in the sense of what is fascism? Nasty people. Not entirely nasty people who are strongly nationalistic. And this program has nothing to do with nationalism, it's just Americans themselves dealing with their internal problems. but that was considered unconstitutional. I think they were right. The NRA is this, you could call it, unholy alliance between business and the government, although a lot of people thought it was anti-business. But it kind of, here you go, manufacturers and retailers are guaranteed. There's a fair price on just about everything. I think across state lines, the government could say fair price. In fact, there was one case of a wheat farmer who had his wheat just in, let's say, Montana, and he said, "Well, he protested and went to court. You can't tell me how much to charge for my wheat." And the court, the federal government said, "No, because your wheat is made into bread, which is sold all over America. So therefore, you are under the NRA." I find that scary, and a lot of the Supreme Court did also, and they made it unconstitutional. And this, again, was not fascism in the sense that they could try to overthrow the government or anything. The government didn't try to take over. But Roosevelt did try to change the Supreme Court pact, that they called it then, that these are 9 old men. They're telling us how to run this country. And so he said, we're going to have from now on an age limit, and we're going to expand the court. And this is where President Roosevelt came his first and biggest defeat during the Depression, because really it was a grassroots opposition. Don't mess with our Supreme Court. And he finally had to back down and still have what we basically have today. And so that was one of his first, I say his worst failure in the Depression. But things were getting better by the mid-30s, 1934, 1935. Unemployment was going down, employment was going up, and happy days are here again. It's an old song from the 1920s, but the Democrats took it over. Happy days are here again. The sun is shining clear again. And so another federal election in 1936. And Roosevelt ran again against a Republican, Alf Landon, formerly governor of Kansas. And Landon was clobbered. I mean, it was just, it was one of the most one-sided elections in history. And it was, Landon was I'd say most one-sided. I don't have the exact statistics on it. And he, afterwards, I think Roosevelt kind of got arrogant and thought he could, and that's why he wanted to, that's about that time that he wanted to pack the Supreme Court as well, and got slapped in the face for it. As a matter of fact, in the next congressional elections in 1938, the Democrats lost, not substantial, but enough to say, well, this is not just going to be Democrats forever. It's hard to think about that time, though. I was talking about how it's so much, in so many ways, different from us. All we know is inflation. All my life, all I've known is inflation. Okay, in those days, it was depression, and the whole idea was to bring in inflation. Roosevelt inflated the money supply deliberately. In fact, he said Americans can't own gold anymore, except for dentists, for make fillings, and collectors of antique coins. And that kind of scares me too. You can't own gold because most of the things you can't own are dangerous substances. You can't own explosives, for example, and in many places you can't own guns because they're considered dangerous. But what is so dangerous about owning gold? Well, now you see, gold keeps the price of things down. Everything has to be backed in gold, and there's not that much gold. So therefore, we've got to take the gold out of the dollar. And he was able to get away with that. So that's crazy. First of all, people are hungry, and you cut down the amount of food. People don't have much money, so you cut down the value of money. He said, well, that's just cheap, just produce more paper money. Well, that always leads to inflation. But the Depression was so severe, so widespread, that there was no hint of inflation during the 1930s. Another thing about the 30s was that pacifism was strong. It was strong in the 20s even. We got suckered into World War I, but then World War then in the 1930s, it was even stronger. There are a number of books and movies like All Quiet on the Western Front, which they're just futile. I mean, the Germans are okay, the French are okay. I mean, the British are okay. So why do we have to fight? And I'll tell you why they fought. It's the big armaments manufacturers, the builders of the battleships and the huge cannons and all. They even almost start wars to increase. So there's been never any hint of that. Now, obviously, they made money, but there's not much evidence, and certainly in the democracies, that they were able to start a war to increase their filthy profit margins, which are outrageous anyway. But people believe that. That's why they went. That's why they went to war. So no wars. And this is not just an American thing. I think one reason it accelerated in the 30s was there were more books coming out about the horrors of World War I and the armaments manufacturers. In England, the Oxford Union, which was the debating club, which is the elite of Oxford, which is the elite of English universities, if you will. Well, they're all pretty much the same, or they used to be. Not a good university, the mediocre university. They're all pretty good. But anyway, the elite of the elite, the creme de la creme, was the Oxford Union, and they voted in 1933. This country, they've resolved. This country, this House will not go to war for king or country. That's pretty serious stuff. And then in America, it wasn't as much as one. It's just scattered. There were clubs like the Veterans of Future Wars. Young women would take oaths that they will never marry anybody who doesn't take an oath that he will never go to war. Young women say, I'm not going to go out with a guy, certainly not marry a guy who isn't a complete pacifist. So, however, for all that pacifism, it always depends on whose ox is gored. And in 1937, the Spanish, 1936, late 36 or something, the Spanish Civil War began. Now, here's a war that you have a lot of terrible poverty and tremendous gap between rich and poor in Spain. And to exacerbate the situation, a group of Spanish officers were objected to the relatively modest socialist government in Spain that was trying to do something about the poverty there, and started a revolt. They're going to overthrow the government, which is not, unusual in Spain at that time. And it became a struggle between right and left. It became an interest of all the developed world. Can Spain be saved for freedom, for socialism, for freedom, even communism? Or is fascism, serious fascism, which is, it's brutal, okay? And so this the Francisco Franco, officer, general, led the fight against and in this case, the left was the rebels, and the right, the right were the rebels, and the left was the legitimate government, which had won the previous election. And Franco and his followers didn't like that. So what happened then was from all over the developed world, a lot of young men went to fight for Spain and freedom. Of course, a lot of them had the time to do it because they didn't have jobs. In America, we had the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was composed of young men fighting for Spain. And it's interesting that this was a very progressive organization, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and it was racially integrated. As a matter of fact, one of a battalion officer, Oliver Laws, a black guy, formerly unemployed and a black guy, and he led, the first U.S. forces to be led by a black man, African American. He was killed in action later on, so he was an upfront officer, and I think that I think he should be more remembered than he was. Oliver Laws, and the first black guy to command white troops or mixed troops in combat. Well, the British had the Attlee Brigade, named after the British labor leader. The French had the the McDonald Papineau Brigade, which was named after a Canadian rebel. Yes, Canada had a few rebels, and a Frenchman. I forget what Papineau. I guess he was a French rebel. They were all fighting in Spain, and they helped to save Spain. Franco was almost got the city of Madrid, but the Lincoln Brigade, the International Brigade, as we call it all together, of all these volunteers, stopped it, made a difference there, and participated. Terrible losses. I would say at least a third of them were killed in action, and others were wounded. And it was they threw themselves into the war. They felt this was a war worth fighting for. We weren't drafted. I mean, we weren't even fighting for a government. We're for our government. We're fighting for theirs. We're fighting for freedom and liberty. And the problem in Spain, though, was the communists kind of took over, and of course, a number of communists did join in the first place, to join the various international brigades, but eventually the communists pretty well called the shots. And eventually the International Brigade was withdrawn from Spain. And in Spain, it was a heartbreaker. The good guys lost. And so it seemed like to Americans that as if the Depression wasn't bad enough that the good guys lose in Spain. And I think this is one reason why one of the reasons why the Depression was so depressing. But the other reason was in 1930, after Roosevelt's great triumph in 1936, just after that, in 1937, we had a recession within a depression. So now you can't say things are getting better. You say, well, they're better than they were in 1932, but still, that was depressing. And some say, well, that's because the government of the Roosevelt administration cut back on government spending, which then, because that's about all main thing we had to keep it going. And so it was more precipitous, the fall, than from 1932 to 29 to 32. So it was from a much lower level, but the fall was more abrupt, as it were. And that was depressing, as I say, that and the loss of Spain, although Spain didn't finally capitulate to the fascists until 1939. So between 37 and 39, well, they were depressed about the recession. Okay, it wasn't quite a depression, it was a recession. I think people were just getting used to it. Matter of fact, getting used to living in a depression. Roosevelt was very much in what had his brains trust, as they called it. All these trusts going back to the old big corporations that controlled everything. Well, these were the brain leaders, all the leaders of the universities, especially economists and scientists and so on. I don't know if they had any historians on it or not. I don't think so. And they formed this organization called the National Commission of Economic Research, something like that. And it had all these big domes on it. And their conclusion, among other things, was that we live in a mature economy. That is, we're not going to grow. We hope to make things better, more, even it out a bit and so on, curb the power of big business. But it'll be a mature, and a lot of their shots were, I trying to think of what they got right. They never foresaw the growth of this economics. You see, they never foresaw the growth of aviation, commercial aviation, or of they had television. They didn't think the television was going to amount to very much. Almost every one of their predictions was wrong, because what they do is what most prognosticators do. They take present day trends and then just say, well, it's basically, they don't say it that way, but that's what they think it's going to just be that way into the future. I mean, can you name any serious prognostication that came true? Now, obviously, we knew World War II was going to come, and it did. The Civil War, and it did. But I mean, it takes a little bit of thinking and serious. What particular products are going to sell, and then what's going to be interest rates, that sort of thing. If you know, so I kind of hold that up as, you don't really know the future by getting the smartest people around. But what kind of people do you get around? Well, that's another story. So at any rate, the Depression did not end, as I say at the beginning of this talk, with Roosevelt. He made it better, made us feel better about it. It did not stop until the war in Europe began, like September 1st, 1939, and then Europe could not supply all the supplies themselves. The French and the British began to place war orders in the United States. One of the, probably some of you men only men at that time, drove had ridden in the Deuce and a Half truck, the 6x. You'll know what I'm talking about. That was originally a French order, and they were actually on orders. And Roosevelt said, "Hold it, stop. We need those trucks." And so this was, I think, the fall of France. And then we need the trucks now. The French aren't going to. And that became the Deuce and a Half 6x, which I would consider the greatest truck that was ever made. It, except for its gas mileage, I think it was 6 miles per gallon. But I'm sure every single GI, World War II, and probably through Korea, Vietnam, rode in a Deuce and a Half truck. You look at the Army truck that you drove in, if you're a veteran, you'll remember the Deuce and a Half. It's originally a French order. Well, my father, he kind of batted around during the Depression, just jobs here, jobs there, gigs, this young man. And he actually tried to join the military during the war. And that's during the Depression, that's an interesting point. The Army had everybody they needed because people wanted to join. And the year he wanted to join, they were only taking veterans. And I've heard in other years, they just closed down the recruiting. Why should you spend money on recruiting? Because, we got everybody we need. I was reading about a pilot, a guy who, imagine if you can't even get into the infantry, try to get into the Air Corps. Well, this guy actually was a very good fighter, and he got into the Air Corps. And he said that their food rations, their chow had been, the amount of money had been set in the 1920s. And they cut all the pay and everything in the Depression by 10%. But still, there was so much left over from the previous economy that he said they were getting steak and eggs every morning for breakfast. And they got tired of steak and eggs. And then the mess sergeants would distribute cartons of cigarettes because you know how it is in the government. If you don't spend it, you'll lose it in the next budget. So they used it up with cartons of cigarettes. Boy, that shows how different things were in those days as well. Well, my dad, he got his first real job working for Brewster Aircraft Company. And that was a terrible company. They were so bad. Their planes were so bad, they were actually closed down during the war. I mean, that's something, you close down an aircraft factory in wartime. But anyway, that's the way things were in the 30s. Imagine that generation that, well, maybe slightly older than my father, but the generation that would be that went through World War I and good times in the 20s, okay, and then the Depression, and then World War II. I mean, things didn't really get better until the late 1940s. So that's the story of the Great Depression, the most serious in American history. Not the only one, though. We had repression, it seemed like every 20 years, 1837, 1859, 1873, and then in 1893, very bad depression, 1893 to 1907. And then World War I intervenes. And then, of course, the big one. But the difference was, they said at the beginning, the government did not end these by giving individual monies to people. One of the recent ones, the first serious one before the Great Depression, 1920, when all the government contracts in World War I were canceled pretty abruptly, and a lot of unemployment. Henry Henry Ford was desperate to sell Fords at the time. He just unload them on the dealers and say, "You sell it or else you'll lose your franchise." And the Ford franchise then was a license to print money, so they were just cutting the prices on Fords right down. You could buy a Ford for $265, a stripped down Ford, but a real Ford for that, because they're desperate to sell them. And what happened? The Depression ended. And we never talk about the Depression of 1920 because it ended without a big change. The time was pretty bad, yeah, but then it was over. Whereas this Depression, 1930s, it's still with us. The whole idea of the government helping you, no matter what it is, say, well, this is terrible. The government's got to do something about it. And rightly or wrong, I'm not making any political comments on that. But the big thing, one of the main thing is that, of course, Roosevelt did not end it. It was probably too big even for Roosevelt to end it, although he tried, and although he made it better, it made us feel better about it as well. Well, that's it. The Great Depression, 1930s through to 1939. Thanks for listening. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.